this evening. I believe you all know that I'm Sister Therese, the Chancellor at Salve, Regina, and am very, very pleased tonight to welcome a friend, someone I consider a friend, as our guest lecturer this evening. I believe that you all know about Dr. Prince's background, given that we have promoted this lecture and shared his information regarding Dr. Prince, which is also in the program. But I'd like to know just a couple of things. On a personal level, as you know, he did serve as president of Hampton College for 16 years. But his experience really spans a very wide array of teaching and service on not-for-profit boards throughout the world, actually. And his work right now as a senior consultant for Pathways to College is very, very important for the future of our nation as we really look for people who will commit themselves to helping our young people who do not have the access that we would like everyone to have, helping them to attain higher education. But, you know, he does have an international reputation, and I must say from personal experience that his international reputation as an advocate for education actually pales only to his reputation as an advocate for what is best in education for the individual student. Because Greg is always thinking about what is best for the student. He's a person who listens to students as well as to others, but he listens very carefully. We first met about 5 years ago in Strasbourg, France. We were both attending a meeting, an international educational meeting at the European Council. And we had several enjoyable dinners together and did a little shopping together too, and had some fun doing that. And that's when I learned about his passion for education and his interest in advocating for students. He has certainly been a role model for all administrators in education, and he practices what he has learned from students. He listens to them, he respects and engages the students, he models those values that he would like to instill in students. And finally, but not least, he really enjoys them. And from my own personal experience, I can say students are a lot of fun, and we enjoy them, and I'm very, very happy this evening to welcome Dr. Gregory Prince.
One thing I can say about the first time I met Sister Therese, we were with a group of educators, and we would meet at the European Council meeting in Strasbourg, and then we'd go out for dinner together, and then we'd walk back. And there were people from all over the United States. And as we walked through sort of the old part of Strasbourg, you could just almost type the institutions by their endowments. Those with the high endowments would drop off at the 4-star hotel. Then we go to the 2-star hotel. And then Sister Therese and I were still walking as we left the 1-star hotel. But I will say that Sister Therese, she was on the right side of the river, the upside of the river. And then I would say goodnight to her, and then I would cross the river to the -1 star. Because Hampshire had no endowment. But I felt that she was careful with the resources of this university. I respected her, and I thought that that was very appropriate. And I enjoyed the walks that we had as we left all those others in those nice hotels. Tonight, this talk is in part an invitation. It's an invitation to the university and to the students. Because part of the paper that I'm going to give, parts of it come out of my book, and parts of it will be in a paper that I'm preparing for the New England Association of Schools and Colleges for its 125th anniversary. And I chair that committee, the 125th anniversary committee. And as I told Sister Reed, I only have one arrow in my quiver. Whatever the problem is, whatever the challenge, whatever I'm supposed to do, is involve the students. And so the theme for the 125th anniversary is listening to students. And we've extended invitations to every institution in New England that's accredited by NEASC. Some of you may not be aware, but it's the only regional accrediting institution that is a single body accredits every institution from Harvard up to kindergarten. And people in Washington often wonder how can the same institution accredit kindergartens and Harvard? And I said it's easy, but that's just because I'm a Yale graduate. But the involvement of students in this, and what we've asked the students is to participate in a series of convocations, the next of which will be October 15th and 16th, 15th at Harvard, where NIAS was founded, and the following day we'll continue the same meeting. We'll continue at the Boston Latin School, which is the oldest educational institution in the United States. And I hope that some of the students here, I will be able to entice them to participate in that conversation, which will be recorded, which will involve a Skype conference, video conference with students in China and perhaps 2 other countries. And we have always tried, we have in each of these situations tried to involve students from other countries. So this is in part an invitation. This lecture is to try to entice you to come, and I will come back to that at the end. What I'm going to talk about is what I think are the 3 major changes in the world today that are affecting how we educate individuals and how we, who are educating individuals, educate ourselves. 3 major changes that we must deal with. The first, what in using, I'm borrowing a phrase that I first came across from a Betty Chan Po King, who is the president of the Yu Chung Foundation in Hong Kong, who started an international school. And she talks about the challenge of educating students in a zero-time, zero-distance world. That's really another variation of the Friedman flat, the earth is flat theme, but it's one I like a lot more because it seems more dynamic. And in fact, she's describing how if you're going to educate students in this world, you cannot simply put them on parallel tracks and say, this is what we're doing in China, this is what we're doing in the United States. Go study in China for a while, go study in the United States for a while. You have to fuse those 2 educational systems, the Confucian system and basically the Enlightenment education traditions of the West, if you're going to really prepare students to live in a zero-distance and a zero-time world. The concept is one that any megastar understands, any world leader understands, anybody who has acted in some way and suddenly finds themselves notarized or otherwise noted worldwide within seconds of what they've done. People understand what that means viscerally, if no other way. It is a concept that basically eliminates the sense that we're an east and west divide or a north-south divide. The world is, in effect, coming together and compressing. If you're a physicist, you may begin to think of the Big Bang and then the compression as the shrinking of matter comes back together, and that may lead to some other explosion. But it is a world that is shrinking. The other theme is that power is shifting in this world, and because of the zero-distance time phenomenon, power is shifting from the state to the individual. And again, if you look at Twitter, you know in terms of the capacity for things to go viral, that an individual can have a tremendous impact and influence instantaneously. Every world leader understands what that means in terms of the power shifting from the state to the individual. Anybody who's had to deal with terrorism, the threat of terrorism, understands it. People understand, they deal with it all the time, but we have to educate our students to learn how to deal with and to live in a world where the individual is gaining power and where the state is losing power. The third theme is that in this world, because of the zero distance, zero time, and because of the increasing power of the individual, the communities in which we live are also being transformed. And that we're losing the sense that a community is a geographical space and that there are concentric communities beyond the one that you're in, each one successively further away. Our communities are amorphous, they change constantly, they're fluid, we're in communities and out of communities instantaneously. If you're using Twitter or Facebook or any of the electronic means of communicating, you have different kinds of communities. And we have to look at that and think of how we educate individuals to deal with that and how we ourselves are changing because our own institutions themselves are changing as the communities within them change. So these are the 3 themes, the 3 forces that I think are changing the world in which we live and are changing education as a whole. In a world where where zero time and zero distance are becoming the force, we must live and learn how to think in a very different way. We have to think in what I would call systems analysis, systems dynamics processes. We have to think in ways that show the interconnections of things, not their separations. I don't know if many of you have done systems dynamics modeling. I have not, and I'm not trained in it, but I have studied it. And it is a way that forces you to think about the connections between everything feeds back and connects to everything else. It's what I would call thinking in a spherical sense, not in a linear sense. In a spherical sense, everything is connected, and everything is connected from multiple, infinite numbers of points. There is no hierarchy in that kind of world. In that kind of world, we also must deal with, in terms of the individual gaining power, we have to understand what it means to educate our own students to think and act in a world where you no longer necessarily have to be in a huge organization to have impact. Any democracy movement in a place like Iran can talk about this instantaneously. They know what this concept means when we say the individual is gaining power. We know those societies that are trying to ban the use of cell phones, whether it be Cuba or Iran. Why? Because they're afraid of the power that is being given to the individual. They fear it. It is a power that has tremendous potential, and it has a power for tremendous harm. It requires a much greater sophistication for our own students to live in that kind of world. It's a world where a single hacker can create chaos in an entire country, can take down an entire power grid. It's a world in which an individual, a man or a woman, can sit at a consul in Maryland and bomb a house in Pakistan and go home to dinner. It's a world in which a single individual can be singled out and suddenly find themselves in their life ruined instantaneously. We have to teach our students how to handle instantaneous news and communication. We lived through the process. We saw this earlier this summer when an official in the Department of Agriculture, a speech that she had given some time ago was picked up by Fox. One sentence was taken out of it, totally distorted, and played out over the world. And within hours, the Secretary of Education fired her. Now, I don't know who should be condemned more, Fox for publishing and doing what it did, or the Secretary of Agriculture for acting without talking to the person involved. Neither were prepared or taught how to handle this kind of world. They've learned, Fox may have learned something about the power that comes from it, but not necessarily the responsibility. In a world of instant communication, and in a world in which the individual is gaining that power, our communities are changing. And they change in ways that are very difficult sometimes to measure. We know, for example, one example of how a community changed overnight. Some of you follow this in the New York Times, in my state, Vermont. Wheeler Elementary School in Burlington, Vermont. Over the last 5 years, suddenly had its entire community transformed from native Vermonters to immigrant children. And during that process, their scores and their AYP measures went down. And they lost, and they were forced to fire the principal. Well, not forced to fire, they had a choice. The principal could resign and they would be given $3 million, or the principal could stay. Now everybody in Vermont, from the governor, everybody in Vermont considered this probably one, if not the best elementary school in Vermont. But over the space of 5 years, the community changed entirely, and the school had to adapt to that community. And it did adapt. And it was doing incredible work. But it wasn't being measured by the same standards that, it was being measured by the same standards that had been applied all along. Unfortunately, I feel hesitant to do it. I criticized the principal for resigning. I think that school should have turned down the $3 million. Because those immigrant children who knew she cared, knew that she was working to help them become acculturated and to serve and work in the society, watched what happened, and what did they learn? That power matters, and money matters, and the principle goes. And I think more harm was done by the lesson that those students learned in her resignation than would have been done forever by the lack of $3 million that they would have been paid. But I think I was a minority in that judgment. But these forces are changing the way in which we educate, and they're changing the problems that we have to face. What is interesting about these forces is that they come at a time, and we're a part of the story, the United States. They come at a time for education worldwide, when education has moved, partly because of, I would give credit to the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Education has not become just a human right. Education has suddenly become a necessity that even the elites understand their populations need. So we're no longer, as was 1945 and 1948 with the Declaration of Human Rights, we're trying to push education up and push individuals up into the educated class, but pushing them against the force that is holding them down. Suddenly, the elite classes understand that their self-interest requires that everyone receive that education. And education now is becoming a global force that everybody understands the need for. The United States played a critical role in that. Senator Pell played a critical role in that. We led the way with the GI Bill, and followed by the GI Bill, the competition between the private and public universities in this country for students. We created through the GI Bill an understanding in higher education that there really were a lot of good students out there and they didn't all go to school in the East. And these Eastern elite colleges, because of the GI Bill, started having these people arrive from all over the country, and they found that they were really quite exciting students. And what did they do? We got to keep these students when the GI Bill disappeared. So what did they do? They started putting money into financial aid. They created an entire system of financial aid, need-based aid. They pressed financial aid. The publics, who had been educating these students for decades, got a little peeved at the fact that suddenly somebody discovered what they had, and they understood they had to compete. Well, they didn't have to compete on the financial aid side because most of them were state universities, and they had low tuition. They had to compete on the quality side. And so they started making massive investments in building the quality of their universities to keep those students. And the United States took off and ended up with the two best higher education systems in the world, public and private. And the rest of the world watched what that did to this country and said, we need it. And they started competing. And suddenly the United States found itself in a competition. As the world, as time and space began to collapse, as states understood that they needed the power of education, as communities began to be transformed because of education, they said, we must copy ourselves. We must copy the United States. And they started competing. The United States responded, I think, in a very unfortunate way. We looked at it and said, we have to compete. We're in a race. Sputnik began the process. We're in a race with the Russians. We have to build science. And we had a singular focus, and we started trying to build science education. Then the Japanese came along. And we became concerned that the Japanese were out-competing us. And we began to argue that we had to do something about elementary education. And today, as Obama noted, we're 12th in the nation in terms of college graduates. 11 other nations are now ahead of us, where we used to be. And what do we have in the United States? We have a race to the top. We are in a race. Now that doesn't necessarily have to be bad, but I'm arguing that it has unfortunately narrowed our view rather than broadened. We are competing, yes. We do have to strengthen our education. But in using this race analogy, which we've been using for 50 years, we have failed to define what the top is. We've failed to define exactly where we're going in this race. We tend to think of it as a track, as a finish line. The finish line keeps moving because other nations begin to move, but we think of it as very one-dimensional. And I argue that that kind of narrowness has been very unfortunate. And I would argue that policymakers in an earlier generation, individuals like Senator Pell, resisted that. Senator Pell was responsible for opening up education, but he understood that education was not narrowly defined simply in terms of how did we compare with another nation. Education was more complex and was much richer. And as we moved into this sense of that we had to compete in this world, which we do, we learned the wrong lessons from those who we were competing with. We allowed them to define what the track was and what the finish line was. We responded, importantly, by reflecting on our educational failures. But interestingly enough, the whole world was doing that. And interestingly enough, the entire world came to the same conclusion. Everybody's education system was failing. But we didn't go beyond that question, and I would argue other nations have. They understood that this is not simply how we do compared to other nations, how we prepare ourselves to deal with those forces. We have limited ourselves by thinking of ourselves in that race. And the consequences are, I think, apparent in both elementary, K through 12 education, and in higher education. And I will talk about each of those systems a little bit. But I will summarize by a quote that I begin my book to teach them to challenge authority. In summarize, read this and you don't have to read the book. But it's a quote from the Minister of Education in Singapore, when he was asked by Fareed Zakaria, who I think is one of the really brilliant columnist writers in journalism today. And he was interviewing the minister, and he asked a very blunt question. In effect, he says, why do Singapore students that lead the world in national exams and all the exam measures a decade later, or a generation later, or 20 or 30 years later, aren't needing anything? Kind of blunt, abrupt question to ask the Minister of Education of a particular country. And the Minister of Education responded, you have to understand, we both have meritocracies. Yours, the U.S., is a talent meritocracy. Ours is an exam meritocracy. There are some parts of the intellect that we are not able to test well, like creativity, curiosity, a sense of adventure, ambition. Most of all, America has a culture of learning that challenges conventional wisdom, even if it means challenging authority. These are the areas where Singapore must learn from America. The irony is that America has chosen to ignore that lesson and to copy the exam meritocracy. And the title for the book comes from that phrase. In many respects, the real understanding of liberal education and the mission of education is stronger outside the United States, who observe the United States, than it is in the United States, because we have become so used to it. What makes the essence of our education. So let me look at a minute K through 12 education. There, I think, where I'm headed is not, you can understand where I'm headed. There are two problems, though, I think, in the way we've looked at education. And they are linked to the zero-time and zero-distance world. The first is that we have lost our understanding of the complexity of education. We have lost our ability to understand that education is a very difficult, very time-consuming, very complex, very hard process and goal and enterprise. I would argue it is more complicated than any other profession, whether it be law, or medicine, or engineering. I would be challenged on that, but I would defend it. It is the ultimate difficult profession. We, in turn, have come to the conclusion that we can save K through 12 education, which has major problems, by testing. And we didn't start there. A Nation at Risk, that was published, was that wake-up call. A Nation at Risk was for education what Rachel Carson's The Silent Spring was for the environmental movement. It was a wake-up call at their major problems. And A Nation at Risk was a fairly sophisticated, I don't agree with everything in it, fairly significant, sophisticated analysis of what was taking place in education and the need for changes. And it called for complex changes that over time, in part because of the culture wars, because of trying to create content standards became so difficult, morphed into, we'll focus on English and math, and we'll test everyone. No Child Left Behind was not a partisan bill. It was a bipartisan bill that had the support of everyone. No Child Left Behind has created a very simplistic view of education. And it's encouraged a reform movement in the United States that basically believes that we can solve the education problems in the United States through what I would call magic bullets. We're going to make small schools. The New York Times had an article yesterday about Broadway. No, small schools don't always do it. Teachers are the focus. Teachers are important. We're going to focus on teacher development. Leadership is important. Foundations pour money into the broad foundation. We're going to focus on superintendents. We're going to focus on all of these different issues. Whole language teaching, that's the key. That's going to save American education. We have been chasing magic bullets for 30 years, and there has not been fundamental change. What's been missing is an understanding that education in its complexity requires all of those things. New England Association of Schools and Colleges accredits institutions on a group of standards, and they argue you have to pass every standard. Their premise is that it takes all of those pieces to make a successful school. But conversely, any one of them can destroy a school. So you have to bring all of the pieces together into a whole that creates a successful school. Schools are very complex organisms. They also are very specific communities. You cannot pass, I would argue, you cannot create a nationwide standard. If you do, you're going to end up with Wheeler Elementary Schools in Burlington, Vermont. Because the communities in our schools will change. A lot of our schools have communities that change within 5, 3, 4 years. They're constantly in flux. And every community creates its own culture. The other thing that I think has failed, not only the kind of one-size-fits-all in K through 12 education, the other thing that's failed is it's always top-down. This goes back to my one arrow in my quiver. We've argued, I work for a program called Pathways to College. Our mantra is that we only work in the, what I call super stressed schools. So I spend my time in Camden, New Jersey, Newark, New Jersey, Detroit, Michigan, Flint, Michigan, Gary, Indiana, the garden spots of America. These are communities that are beyond stressed. I went to Gary, Indiana. We had to drive 20 minutes out of town to find a place to eat lunch. The town is it's not dangerous, it's empty. It looks like an early western town where there's a house and vacant lots and you can see through one block to the next block and out into the prairie. Those old black and white pictures of early cities. The town has simply died. Those kind of communities need help. And our mantra is that the fastest way to change the high schools in those, any school in those communities, but particularly high schools where we work, are to get the students to do it. Students listen to students, and they watch adults. Students don't listen to adults, they watch adults. They watch what adults do. But they listen to each other. Peer pressure, next to the church, maybe ahead of the church, is the most significant force affecting young people. If you can get peer pressure to work with you, you can ride the wave. If it's against you, you will struggle, you will be able to work, make some changes, but you will not make a fundamental change. And if the communities are changing fast, then you have to create a culture in which the students are going to help make the school good. We go into a school, take 100 students, say, we're going to give you a safe place to be smart, we're going to get you into college, we're going to give everything you need to get to college, but you, in return, have to create a culture in your school that is cool to be smart. And that will change the school. That will reinforce whatever the flavor of the day is in terms of reform. You need to have a bottom-up as well as a top-down strategy. So we think that K through 12 education itself has to find a way to understand the world in which it's living. These single-focused reforms all are useful, but they're not sufficient unto themselves. Let me look a second at higher education. Higher education hasn't been under the same kind of attack. It hasn't had the same kind of problems that K through 12 education, public education, has had in this country. But I would argue that it is facing equally important challenges. If you talk about a world in which the zero time and zero distance is the driving force, and you think about the international education that we offer our students, is simply not adequate. Sending students abroad for a semester is good, but it's not sufficient. It's better than nothing. Ways to have students, when they go abroad, to really integrate and deal with and have to come and engage with those communities and have what they learn and have those processes come back and engage the institution. I worked for 19 years at Dartmouth College. It's a great institution. It has 66% of its students studying at least one term in another country. 50% of its students studied one term in another country in another language in their major. You can't imagine. That to me is nirvana. But I argued then, and I think they would agree, that the institution was not that different. Because we had not found ways to really fuse this sense that we are in a world where cultures change and move and interact with each other. It's not that you abandon your culture, but you have to understand how they overlap and integrate, not just in parallel forms, but integrated forms. In a world with individuals have the power that they have, are we preparing our students to deal with that power ethically? We lived through in an earlier time the Enron crisis. We recently lived through AIG and Lehman Brothers, basically mirror images of what happened to Enron, separated by 10 years and no learning. But the reality is that higher education educated all of those people who behaved in the way they did that led us to the crisis that we faced. People would argue that's not fair to hold us responsible for what they did. But I argue that higher education says we're important to the economy, we're important to the country, invest in us. But if we make that claim, then we have to be responsible for the outcome. So how do you educate students to understand the ramifications of the power that they do have? How do you give them the values that they need? How do you educate people? I found it exciting in one sense that Petraeus and all the generals in Afghanistan were reading Greg Morton's 3 Cups of Tea. I found it distressing that they discovered it because the wife of one of the generals, and the wife, I emphasize, introduced it. I think it was Colin Powell's wife, introduced it, and it came through the spouses, all wives in this case, of the general. They went through our education system. They did discover it, to their credit. But it was, I think, late in coming. And I talked about the Department of Agriculture. So we have to educate our students to understand the kind of power that they do have as individuals and what can be done with that power. So I think that these 3 themes are changing the way we deal with education. I think the community issue also affects higher education. We are dealing with different communities, new communities, different ages, different races, different nationalities. Our communities are changing, and we have to learn how to educate and respond to and incorporate them into our systems, and I think we're very slow at it. So the question is, what should be then the purpose of education in this kind of world? And you have sheets in your paper there where I outline what I think are 4 basic principles that I hold to be the core of what I mean by the purposes of education. And we're going to come back to this in the questionnaire. I'm not going to read them to you. You have them in front of you. But I'm going to ask you to read them and then challenge me or ask me questions about those purposes. But it is an argument that education is not about content. It is about character. It is about ethics. It is about behavior. It is about attitudes. It is about how we behave. You need knowledge. It is about what I call providing a liberal education. My definition of a liberal education is very succinct. It is an education that develops your capacity to think clearly, critically, and creatively, to act humanely, or to judge wisely, and to act humanely, collaboratively, and to communicate effectively. You could add words in there. I use humanely, collaboratively, to capture the ethical component, but to try to be more than just the ethical component. But that is the purpose of education. You need knowledge, but in the end, we can't teach anybody enough that they need to know. But we have to teach them is that if they are going to think critically, to know what they need to know what they don't know, to know how to get what they don't know in order to act and to think clearly. That is the only, I would argue, the only mission of education. Everything else falls from it. Hampshire College was obviously a very liberal, very unstructured place. And as I was telling Sister Reese, every parent said to me, what is my child going to do when they graduate? Will they ever get a job? You know, and every student designed their own major, so you can imagine the titles. 1,200 people dreaming up the most crazy themes. And I would look down and say, please understand, our mission is to not help your child get a job. Our mission is to help your child create a job. And that, in the end, is, I think, what our real mission should be. Because most of my family, they're all involved in environmental issues. When I was in college, I mean, there was no, you couldn't prepare anybody for the job because the job didn't exist. Now, generation is making a living that way. Most of what they will be doing, most of what your students will be doing are in things that we don't have, that we don't know, and we can't teach them about because they don't exist. So that is the purpose of education. And in doing that, we have to understand that to teach an individual, to have that kind of creativity, to have that kind of courage, is in effect to teach them to challenge authority. They have to be willing to question. They have to have the courage to stand up and say it has to be different. They have to have the courage to say that this is unethical. They have to have the courage to say it needs to be done a different way. They have to have the courage and to know how to do that in the face of power. And that, therefore, becomes an essential dimension of the university. The university, the book was written against those who would argue the university should be neutral. And I argue, no, the university should model the behavior we expect of our students. If we expect our students to challenge issues, to be engaged, to stand up for principles, then the university has to do the same. The university has to have a mission, and it has to be willing to act on that mission. It cannot be neutral. It must act and support its mission. And that's why very people are always strange. I said, in many respects, Hampshire, Catholic universities all have a very common thing. People think it was being very different. We're more liberal, more conservative. But they're both very mission, value-oriented institutions that do not remain neutral in a society. And we're teaching our students how to be open-minded, how to be firm at the same time. We're teaching them how to have a discourse when you disagree, how to challenge authority through discourse. And there I come to the last point, which you have as another sheet. To teach students to challenge authority, you have to teach them how to communicate. You have to teach them how to have discourse in a constructive way. You have to teach them what I call the principles of discourse. And I argue these are not free speech. It's not the same as free speech. The principles of discourse, I argue, to the academy are what free speech is to the society as a whole, but they're not identical. Free speech allows you to say anything. The principles of discourse are how you try to create a healthy society. And those are the principles that we need to teach our students, we need to model in our institutions. That is what education should be teaching to fifth graders, to college students, and to graduate students. I don't think AYP measures that. I don't think anything measures it. The only way you measure it is to look at the whole school, the whole context, and have a very clear sense of what the mission is, and are you accomplishing it. And then measure it for that institution, in that community, in that context. So that is what I argue is where education needs to go. We need to accept the complexity of our world and find a way to deal with our institutions as complex organisms that have to respond to this kind of world in which we live. I'd like to open it up now to questions and to particularly those who'd like to challenge what I think are the purposes of education and to what I argue are the principles of discourse in pursuing them. Thank you very much.